He prepared for death at 60 and woke up at 100. At 60, he believed the story was almost over. At 100, he realized it had barely begun. Somewhere between those years, time changed its rules. The moment that matters arrived with a diagnosis, carefully delivered, precisely explained. Numbers were used to soften the impact, but the message was clear. Life, as he understood it, was nearing its conclusion. This matters today because we live inside forecasts, retirement calculators, health predictions, risk charts that quietly decide how much future we believe we have. And once belief collapses, behavior follows. He was practical. He adjusted his plans, sold what he no longer needed, simplified his world to prepare for absence. He gave away belongings while he still could, not dramatically, methodically. Friends treated him differently. Conversations shortened. Assumptions formed. Even hope became cautious, as if optimism itself needed permission. At first, the preparation felt responsible, liberating. Even with the future narrowed, choices became easier. No long-term thinking, no deferred dreams. Everything focused on closure. Then something unexpected happened. Nothing. Time passed. The body did not collapse. The decline slowed, then paused. Months stretched into years without explanation. Appointments became confusing. Charts contradicted themselves. Predictions expired quietly. No one announced a change. But the ending refused to arrive. And that is where the real story begins. Because living toward death is one thing. Waking up inside a future you already abandoned is something else entirely. This was not survival. It was disorientation, and it would force him to relearn how to live. Only then did time reveal its second act. The first challenge was psychological, not physical. He had already said goodbye to the future. Now the future had returned, uninvited. Plans had been dismantled, savings redirected, relationships closed with finality. He had treated time like a finite resource already spent, and suddenly, it was accumulating again. At first, he lived cautiously, as if the extension might be revoked. He avoided commitments, refused long-term promises, kept life deliberately small. But years continued to pass. 5 became 10. 10 became 20. The body aged, but did not collapse. The illness retreated into background noise. This created an unusual tension. Living longer without permission. Surviving beyond emotional preparation for death. Every additional year carried uncertainty, not celebration. Friends who once offered sympathy now expressed confusion. Some envied him. Others avoided the reminder of unpredictability. He outlived assumptions, then outlived the people who made them. What surprised him most was the emptiness left by preparation. When you organize your life for an ending, you strip it of expansion. And rebuilding is harder than decay. He had to relearn desire, relearn curiosity, relearn how to imagine beyond the next year. Skills not practiced during survival. The conflict deepened because time had given him years, but not instructions on how to use them. Longevity, he realized, can be disruptive. It does not automatically bring meaning. Meaning must be rebuilt deliberately. And as the decades accumulated, one question followed him relentlessly. What do you do with a life you already finished living? The answer would arrive slowly, not through insight, but through action. The shift began without intention, a small decision, then another, nothing that felt like reinvention. He started by allowing himself to plan again, a short trip, a minor commitment, something scheduled far enough away to acknowledge a future. Each plan felt risky, as if time might object, but time remained silent. Days kept arriving. Years stacked quietly on top of each other. And slowly, trust returned. He stopped living defensively, stopped treating every moment like borrowed property. Instead of preparing for loss, he began to allow for growth, not ambition, just expansion. Emotionally, this was the hardest phase, because rebuilding a future requires hope. And hope had been carefully dismantled years earlier, piece by piece. For survival, he felt anger at times, not at the diagnosis, but at the years spent shrinking his world unnecessarily. He had mourned himself too early, and grief, once rehearsed, leaves residue. Yet something unexpected happened. The extra years sharpened his awareness. He noticed details he once ignored. Morning light, unrushed conversations, the satisfaction of continuity. The conflict reached its deepest point here, because longevity did not feel like a gift. It felt like responsibility. A responsibility to live fully after rehearsing the end. He realized the danger was not death. It was premature closure. Ending your story before time does. As his 100th year approached, there was no celebration planned, no announcement, just quiet recognition. He was no longer surviving. He was inhabiting time again, fully, deliberately, and in that return, a final understanding was forming, one that would redefine what those extra decades truly meant. The realization arrived quietly, without celebration or relief. Longevity had not rescued him. It had confronted him. Living to 100 did not undo the years spent preparing for death, but it reframed them. They became a warning, not a loss. He understood then that time does not belong to predictions. It belongs to attention, to presence, to the willingness to remain open even when endings feel certain. Preparing for death had made him careful. Living beyond it made him intentional. He stopped asking how much time remained. He asked how honestly he was using it. The extra decades did not feel like borrowed time anymore. They felt earned, not through survival, but through return. Return to curiosity. Return to planning. Return to allowing life to surprise him again. His story was never about beating the odds. It was about the danger of surrendering too early, of shrinking your future based on someone else's certainty. Today, we are taught to manage risk, to calculate outcomes, to prepare for loss. But rarely are we taught how to reopen life when loss does not arrive. He woke up at 100 not because time was generous, but because he finally understood its demand. To stay open, to keep imagining, to never close the door before it closes itself. The most painful years were not the ones before the diagnosis. They were the ones immediately after predictions failed, because he had already grieved, already released, already reorganized himself around absence, and then absence had declined to appear. The grief had nowhere to land. It remained in him, unresolved. A mourning without an object, he carried it as a kind of heaviness that confused people who expected him to feel grateful. Gratitude was there, but it coexisted with something more complicated, a sense of having been changed by preparation, in ways that survival did not automatically undo. He was not the same person who received the diagnosis. That person had been systematically dismantled. What remained was someone smaller, more careful, more aware of limits, and deeply uncertain about expansion. Rebuilding required confronting that dismantling directly, not pretending it hadn't happened, not rushing past it into a performance of recovery, but sitting with the person who had been shaped by the expectation of ending and asking honestly what that person still wanted. The answers came slowly. They were quieter than his earlier desires, less about achievement and more about presence, less about legacy and more about attention. The diagnosis had, in a strange way, clarified values that an uninterrupted life might never have forced him to name. He arrived at 100 carrying that clarity, not as a triumph, as a gift he had not expected to receive, and had spent decades learning how to hold. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. There's a broader warning embedded in his story that extends beyond individual experience. Modern medicine has grown skilled at extending life, without growing equally skilled at preparing people for what extended life demands. The tools for adding years have advanced rapidly. The tools for inhabiting the added years have not kept pace. This produces a specific kind of suffering that is rarely acknowledged directly, the suffering of people who expected to die and found themselves years later still living in a life they had already concluded. He was not alone in this. He simply stayed long enough to develop a relationship with the disorientation that others resolve more quickly. either by contracting permanently around the expectation of ending, or by discovering, too late, how to reopen. What he learned was that the reopening was not a single event. It was a direction, a choice made repeatedly, each morning, to allow the day to contain the possibility of something he had not yet imagined. That choice was small. It looked like almost nothing from outside, but it accumulated across decades into a life that the diagnosis had never predicted, and the predictions had never deserved to contain. He outlived the certainty, and in doing so, he revealed its limits, which may be the most important thing any long life can demonstrate. He prepared